The candle in Alina Whitmore's hand shook so badly that wax dripped onto her fingers, and she did not even feel the burn. Her heart was pounding faster than it had ever pounded in her life. She stood outside the library door of Ashworth Hall at midnight, listening to the sound of her own breath, gathering the courage to knock. Inside, she could hear the soft scratch of a pen. The Duke was awake, as he always was at this hour, buried in papers that never seemed to end. She had rehearsed the words 100 times walking up and down the corridor. She had practiced them in the mirror of her small room under the roof, where the wind rattled the shutters every night. But now, standing at the door, every word had vanished from her mind except the two that mattered most. She knocked before her courage could leave her completely. "Come in," said a deep voice from within. Alina pushed the door open. Julian Ashford, Duke of Ashworth, sat behind a wide oak desk, a single lamp throwing gold light across his tired face. He looked up, surprised to see her at such an hour. As governess to his young niece, Alina rarely had reason to seek him out, and never this late. "Miss Whitmore," he said, setting down his pen, "is something wrong with Lily?" "No, Your Grace, Lily is asleep. This is not about her." He studied her face carefully. Something in her eyes, in the way her hands trembled around the candle, told him this was not an ordinary conversation. He rose from his chair. "Then what is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Alina stepped further into the room and closed the door behind her, though she knew it was improper to be alone with him this way. But what she had to say could not be said with servants passing in the hallway. "Your Grace," she began, and her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt as though the whole house had stopped breathing. Julian did not move. His face, usually so composed, so carefully guarded, went pale as ash. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Alina watched him grip the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice low and strange. Alina blinked. Of all the reactions she had imagined, anger, denial, cold dismissal, this was not one she had prepared for. There was no accusation in his voice. There was something else, something that sounded almost like fear. "I assure you, Your Grace, it is true. I have seen the physician in the village. There is no mistake." "No," he shook his head slowly as though trying to wake himself from a dream. "You do not understand. It is not that I doubt you. It is that it cannot be, not with me." Alina's confusion deepened. She had expected many things from this conversation, but never this. She searched his face for some explanation, but found only a man staring at her as if the ground beneath him had cracked open. "I do not understand," she said quietly. Julian ran a hand through his dark hair, turning away from her, walking toward the tall window that looked out over the moonlit gardens. His shoulders were tense, his breathing uneven. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something raw and unguarded, a tone she had never heard him use before. "Years ago, before you came to this house, I was told by the finest doctors in London that I would never father a child. There was an illness, a fever that nearly took my life when I was 25. The physician said it left permanent damage. I was told in no uncertain terms that children were not something I would ever have." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I built my whole life around that truth. I let a woman I once loved walk away because of it. I never questioned it again." Alina stood frozen, the candle wax now cooling and hard against her fingers. She had known the Duke for nearly a year, teaching his niece her letters and her sums, watching him from a respectful distance as he moved through his grand and lonely house. She had seen sadness in him before, buried deep beneath his composure, but she had never known its source. Now she understood, at least in part, why he seemed to carry the weight of the whole estate on his shoulders alone. With no wife, no children, no laughter echoing through halls built for a large and happy family. "I did not know," she said softly. "Few do." He turned back to face her, and in the lamplight his eyes looked almost haunted. "Which is why what you have just told me cannot be possible. Unless the doctors were wrong, unless something has changed, or unless—" He did not finish the sentence, but Alina understood the unspoken accusation hanging in the air between them, even if he had not meant to voice it. Her spine straightened, and something hot and indignant rose in her chest. "Unless I have been unfaithful to a man I have never even courted," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the fear that had gripped her only moments before. "Your Grace, I have worked in this house for 11 months. I have not so much as taken tea with another man in that time. I do not know how to explain what has happened, but I know what is true. This child is yours." Julian's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like shame. He crossed the room quickly, closing the distance between them, and for a moment Alina thought he might reach for her hand. But he stopped himself, remembering the boundaries that stood between a duke and the woman who taught his niece her alphabet. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I did not mean to suggest such a thing. My shock has made me clumsy with my words. It is only that I have spent 7 years believing myself incapable of this. 7 years accepting a truth I thought was carved in stone. And now you stand here telling me that truth may have been wrong all along." Alina's anger softened, though her heart still raced. She could see now that his reaction had nothing to do with doubting her honesty. It had everything to do with a wound so old and so deep that he had never let himself hope it might heal. "Perhaps the doctors were mistaken," she offered gently. "Doctors are not always right, Your Grace." "Perhaps." He said the word as though testing its weight, as though he had not allowed himself to consider it in all this time. He walked to the window again, looking out at the gardens bathed in silver moonlight, at the fountain that had not run properly in years, at the empty nursery wing that had stood untouched since before his own birth. "Or perhaps something else has happened. Something I do not yet understand." Alina watched him, unsure what to say. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, filling the silence between them. She thought of her own fear, walking to this room tonight, wondering if she would be dismissed before dawn, sent away in shame with nowhere to go and no family to take her in. She had prepared herself for cruelty. She had not prepared herself for this strange, quiet grief that seemed to fill the Duke instead. "What will you do?" she asked finally, her voice small in the large, book-lined room. Julian turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had entered, something like resolve settled over his features, replacing the shock that had drained the color from his face. "I will find out the truth," he said. "Whatever it is, I will not turn you out of this house, Miss Whitmore, not tonight and not until I understand what has happened. You have my word on that." It was not the promise of marriage, nor the promise of love, nor even the promise of belief, but it was something, a thread of safety in a night that had begun with nothing but fear. Alina nodded, clutching the candle a little tighter, feeling the wax finally cool against her burned fingers. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Go and rest," he said, though his own eyes looked as though sleep would not come easily to him tonight. "We will speak more of this tomorrow. I promise you, Miss Whitmore, I will not abandon you to face this alone, whatever the truth turns out to be." Alina curtsied, though her legs still trembled beneath her skirts, and turned to leave the library. As she stepped into the dark corridor and pulled the door closed behind her, she heard, faintly, the sound of the Duke sinking back into his chair, and a long, unsteady breath escaping him, the sound of a man whose entire understanding of his own life had just been shaken to its foundation. She walked back toward the servants' stairs in the darkness, her candle flickering with every step, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers yet. Whatever tomorrow would bring, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing in Ashworth Hall would ever be quite the same again. Morning came slowly over Ashworth Hall, gray light creeping through heavy curtains, but Julian had not slept at all. He sat in the same chair where Alina had left him hours before, the fire long since burned to ash, his mind turning over the same question again and again. How could this be true? He thought back to that terrible year, 7 years past, when a fever had swept through him so violently that the household had prepared for the worst. He remembered the physicians gathered around his bed, their faces grim, their voices low as they spoke to his father in the hallway, believing the sick young man could not hear them through the wall. He remembered the words that had shaped the rest of his life. Permanent damage. No hope of children. A line ended, they had said, unless he found some other way to carry his family name forward. He remembered, too, the woman he had loved before all of that. Margaret, bright, warm, full of laughter that used to fill this very house. When he told her what the doctors had said, she had wept not out of pity, but because she understood what it meant for a family such as his, a duchy that needed an heir. She had married another man within the year, a man who could give her children, and Julian had told himself it was for the best. He had built a wall around that part of his heart and had not let anyone near it since. Until Elena Whitmore arrived at his door 11 months ago, quiet and capable, hired to teach his orphaned niece Lily after his sister's passing. He had not expected to notice her the way he did. He had not expected to find himself listening for her voice in the hallways, or watching for her in the garden where she taught Lily her letters beneath the old oak tree. He had told himself it meant nothing. A duke did not fall for a governess. It was not done. It could not be done. And yet here they were. By the time the sun had fully risen, Julian had made a decision. He rang for his valet and dressed quickly, then called for his horse to be readied. There was only one man in London he trusted enough to ask about this, a physician who had studied under the very doctors who had given him his original diagnosis, but who had since become known for questioning old medical assumptions others accepted as fact. Dr. Bennett Hale had a small practice near Harley Street, modest compared to the grand offices of his former teachers, but his reputation for honesty was worth more to Julian than any grand address. Julian arrived unannounced, and the doctor, recognizing him at once, cleared his schedule for the morning without hesitation. "Your Grace," Bennett said, guiding him into a private room. "It has been some years. What brings you to my door in such a hurry?" Julian explained everything, his voice steady even as his hands were not, describing the old diagnosis, the fever, the news he had received the night before from Elena. Bennett listened carefully, asking questions, taking notes, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "I remember your case," Bennett said finally. "I was a young student then, still learning under Dr. Whitfield, who examined you. I will tell you honestly, Your Grace, medicine 7 years ago was not what it is today. Dr. Whitfield was a skilled man, but he was also quick to give final answers where the evidence did not always support them. Fevers such as the one you suffered can cause temporary effects that mimic permanent ones. It is entirely possible, even likely, that what he diagnosed as permanent was, in truth, temporary." Julian sat very still, absorbing the words slowly, as though they might dissolve if he moved too quickly. "You are saying he may have simply been wrong." "I am saying it is possible, and given what you have just told me, it seems more than possible. I would like to examine you properly, with the instruments and understanding we have now, rather than what we had then. It will not tell us with certainty what happened years ago, but it can tell us what is true today." The examination took the better part of an hour. Julian sat through it with the same discipline he brought to every difficult task in his life, though inside, something he had buried for 7 years had begun to stir, cautious and afraid to hope. When it was finished, Bennett sat across from him, folding his hands together. "Your Grace, I can find nothing in you today that would prevent fatherhood. Whatever damage the fever caused, if any, it appears your body has healed in the years since. I cannot tell you with certainty that the child Miss Whitmore carries is yours through medicine alone. That is not something any physician can prove or disprove with an examination. But I can tell you that the belief you have carried for 7 years, that you were incapable of this, was very likely false, even at the time." Julian felt something crack open inside his chest, an old weight lifting so suddenly that he nearly could not breathe. 7 years of silence. 7 years of watching other men speak proudly of their sons and heirs, while he sat quietly in the corner of every gathering, believing his own line would end with him. 7 years of loving Margaret and letting her go because he believed himself broken. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick. "You do not know what this means to me." "I believe I have some idea," Bennett said kindly. "Go home, Your Grace, speak with Miss Whitmore. Whatever the full truth of these matters, she deserves your trust, not your suspicion. From what you have told me of her character, she does not sound like a woman given to deception." Julian rode back to Ashworth Hall with his mind racing faster than his horse. The autumn countryside blurred past him, the golden fields, the stone walls, the familiar bends in the road he had ridden 1,000 times before. But today everything looked different, as though seen through new eyes. He thought of Alina's face the night before, pale with fear yet steady with conviction, insisting on a truth she had every reason to believe would cost her everything. He thought of how he had responded, with shock and suspicion instead of comfort, and shame settled heavy in his stomach. She had come to him in the middle of the night, terrified, carrying news that could ruin her position and her reputation, and he had made her defend her own honor instead of offering her his protection. By the time he reached the hall, the sun had climbed high overhead, and he found Alina in the garden with Lily, sitting beneath the old oak tree just as he had imagined her so many times before. Lily was practicing her letters on a small slate, her tongue poking out in concentration, while Alina watched over her with the patient warmth that had first caught Julian's attention all those months ago. She looked up as he approached, and he saw the guardedness return to her eyes immediately, the fear that he had put there the night before. He hated himself a little for that. "Your Grace," she said, rising and smoothing her skirts. "Lily, why do you not go and find Alice in the kitchen? I believe there are fresh scones today." Lily, delighted at the prospect of scones, scampered off toward the house without argument, leaving Julian and Alina alone beneath the tree's spreading branches. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I went to London this morning," Julian said finally. "I saw a physician, a good one who studied under the doctors who examined me years ago." Alina's expression shifted, curiosity and caution mixed together. "And what did he say?" "He believes the original diagnosis was likely wrong, that what the fever caused may have been temporary, not permanent, and that my body has since healed in ways the doctors then did not understand." Julian paused, searching for the right words, aware of how inadequate any apology would feel. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology. Last night I let my own fear and old grief speak before I let myself truly hear you. I should have believed you from the very first moment without demanding proof or explanation. That was wrong of me, and I am sorry for it." Alina studied him carefully, as though weighing the sincerity of his words against the memory of his shock the night before. Whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension eased from her shoulders. "I understand why you reacted as you did," she said softly. "It must have been a terrible shock after believing something for so many years. I do not hold it against you, Your Grace, but I hope you understand this as well. I did not come to your library last night seeking anything from you, not marriage, not money, not position. I came only because I believed you deserved to know the truth, whatever the consequences might be for me." "I understand that now," Julian said, "and I intend to make certain there are no ill consequences for you, not while I have any say in the matter. You and the child will want for nothing." "You have my word." Alina looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "That is generous of you, Your Grace, but I must ask, what will people say? A duke and his niece's governess. The scandal alone could ruin us both." Julian had not yet allowed himself to think that far ahead, so consumed had he been by the shock of the news itself, and the relief of learning it might be true. Now, standing beneath the oak tree with the woman who carried his child, he realized the road ahead would not be a simple one. His aunt, Lady Constance, had spent years pushing him toward a marriage of wealth and status. The wider world would not easily accept a duke choosing a governess of modest birth, especially not under circumstances such as these. But looking at Alina's face, steady and honest despite everything she had endured in the last day alone, Julian felt something settle firmly in his chest, a resolve stronger than any fear of scandal. "Let them say what they will," he said quietly. "I have spent 7 years living my life around what other people believe to be true about me. I do not intend to spend the rest of it the same way. Whatever comes, Miss Whitmore, I do not intend to abandon you or this child to face it alone." Alina's eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears back quickly, unwilling to let them fall in daylight where a servant might see. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They stood together beneath the tree a moment longer, the autumn breeze rustling the leaves above them, carrying with it the distant sound of Lily's laughter from the kitchen. Neither of them spoke of what would come next, of the difficult conversation still ahead, of the aunt who would not accept this news quietly, or of the wider world that would judge them both harshly. For now it was enough to stand together in the quiet garden, two people bound by a truth neither of them had expected, beginning to trust that perhaps, together, they could face whatever came. But neither of them yet knew that Lady Constance had already heard the servants whispering, and that by evening the news would reach ears far less kind than Dr. Hale's. Lady Constance Ashford had lived at Ashworth Hall for nearly 20 years, ever since her husband's death had left her with no household of her own and a brother-in-law generous enough to take her in. In that time, she had come to think of the estate as partly hers, its future as her responsibility, and its reputation as something she alone had the wisdom to protect. When she heard the whispers passing between two housemaids near the linen closet that afternoon, she did not believe them at first. She could not believe them, but she was not a woman who left rumors unexamined, and so she went straight to the housekeeper, Mrs. Pratt, and demanded the truth. Mrs. Pratt, who had served the family for 30 years and had no wish to be caught between the Duke and his aunt, tried to deflect the question, but Lady Constance was not easily deflected. By the time she left the housekeeper's small office near the kitchens, her face was tight with fury, her hands clenched at her sides. A governess pregnant, and claiming the child was Julian's. She marched through the halls of Ashworth Hall with the fixed determination of a woman preparing for battle, and she found her nephew in his study, going over the estate accounts with his steward. She did not wait for the steward to leave before she spoke. "Is it true?" she demanded, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. Julian looked up, weary already, though the day had barely begun. He dismissed the steward with a nod, and once they were alone, he turned to face his aunt fully. "I assume you are referring to Miss Whitmore," he said evenly. "Do not play games with me, Julian. The whole staff is whispering about it. Is the girl carrying your child?" "She believes so, yes." Lady Constance's face went through several expressions in quick succession, disbelief, then horror, then something colder and more calculating. She sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk, fanning herself though the room was not warm. "This is a disaster," she said. "Do you understand what this means? A governess, Julian, not even a woman of good family, but a governess, hired to teach Lily her letters. If this becomes known, and it will become known, the scandal will follow this family for generations. Every drawing room in London will speak of nothing else. I am aware of the difficulty, Aunt Constance." "Difficulty?" she laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You call this a difficulty. It is a catastrophe. And what of the physicians who told you years ago that such a thing was impossible for you? Have you considered, even for a moment, that this girl may be lying, that she may have found herself in trouble through some other man entirely, and seen in you a convenient solution to her problem, a wealthy duke who might be persuaded to take responsibility for another man's mistake?" Julian's jaw tightened, old protectiveness rising in him faster than he expected. "I have considered it, and I no longer believe it to be true. I saw a physician in London myself, only this morning. He believes the original diagnosis of my condition was very likely incorrect." One physician's opinion against years of established medical understanding. Lady Constance shook her head firmly. "Julian, I have watched over this family for 2 decades. I have seen ambitious women before, women who know exactly how to use a man's guilt and grief against him. You have spent 7 years believing yourself unable to have children. Do you not think it possible that a clever woman might learn such a thing and use it precisely as she has?" "Elena did not know," Julian said firmly. "I never spoke of it to anyone below stairs, nor to most people above them. She could not have known, and even if she had, I do not believe for a moment that she is the kind of woman who would use such knowledge cruelly." "You do not believe it because you do not wish to believe it," Lady Constance snapped. "That is precisely how such women succeed, Julian. They make themselves impossible to doubt." The conversation continued in this manner for some time, Julian growing more resolute with each accusation his aunt leveled, and Lady Constance growing more frustrated that her nephew would not simply agree with her, as he so often had in matters of the estate. Finally, seeing that reason would not move him, she changed her approach entirely. "Very well," she said, rising from her chair, her voice suddenly calm and cold in a way that worried Julian more than her anger had. "If you will not see sense, then I must act to protect this family myself. I will speak with Miss Whitmore directly." "Aunt Constance, I do not think that wise." "It is not your place to decide what is wise for me, Julian. I have lived in this house longer than that girl has been alive. I will not stand by and watch a stranger destroy everything your father and grandfather built." She left the study before Julian could stop her, and though he rose to follow, an urgent letter from his solicitor arrived at that very moment, demanding his attention on a matter of estate business that could not wait. By the time he was free to search for his aunt, nearly an hour had passed, and the damage had already been done. Lady Constance found Alina in the nursery, tidying Lily's books after the day's lessons had ended. She entered without knocking, her expression composed into something falsely pleasant, though Alina, who had learned to read the moods of this household carefully over the past year, saw immediately that something was wrong. "Miss Whitmore," Lady Constance said, closing the door behind her, "I believe we should speak." "Of course, my lady. I have heard the news that has spread through this house today. I understand you have made a rather remarkable claim regarding my nephew." Alina set down the book she had been holding, her hands steady though her heart had begun to race. "It is not a claim, my lady, it is the truth." "Is it?" Lady Constance's smile did not reach her eyes. "You understand, Miss Whitmore, that you are asking a great deal of us to simply accept your word. A governess, with no family of standing, no dowry, no connections, claiming to carry the air of one of the oldest duchies in England. Forgive me if I find that difficult to accept without question." "I have never asked anyone to accept anything without question, my lady. I told the Duke the truth, and what he chooses to believe is his own decision, made freely." "How convenient for you that he has chosen to believe it." Lady Constance moved closer, her voice dropping to something quieter and more threatening. "Let me be plain with you, Miss Whitmore. I do not know whether your claim is true or false, and frankly it hardly matters to me. What matters is the reputation of this family, a reputation my nephew has built carefully over many years, a reputation that cannot survive the scandal your presence here now threatens. I am prepared to offer you a generous sum, enough to see you comfortably settled far from this house, far from London, somewhere you and your child, whoever its father may truly be, can live without want. In exchange, you will leave quietly tonight and never speak of this again." Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "You wish to pay me to disappear." "I wish to protect my family from ruin, Miss Whitmore. Call it what you like." "And what of the Duke's own wishes in the matter? He has told me himself that he does not intend to abandon either myself or this child." "My nephew is not thinking clearly at present. Shock has clouded his judgment. Once the initial shock has passed, he will see reason, as he always does, and he will thank me for having protected him from a decision he would surely come to regret." Lady Constance's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do not mistake his current sympathy for lasting devotion, Miss Whitmore. Men in his position rarely marry governesses, however tender their feelings in a single moment of shock. You would do well to accept my offer while it remains on the table." Alina stood very still, torn between anger at the older woman's cold calculation and a quiet, painful fear that perhaps there was some truth in her words. She had known Julian for less than a day in this new and frightening capacity, and though he had spoken kindly to her that morning beneath the oak tree, she could not be certain his resolve would survive the pressures of his family, his position, and the wider world's judgment. "I will consider your offer, my lady," she said finally, though something in her chest ached at the words. "But I will not decide anything without speaking to the Duke first." "As you wish." Lady Constance moved toward the door, then paused, turning back with one final, pointed remark. "But do consider carefully, Miss Whitmore, what kind of life awaits a child born into scandal and rejection, versus one born quietly into comfort and security, however far from grand titles it may be. Sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do is choose peace over pride. She left the room, and Alina sat down slowly on the small chair beside Lily's writing desk, her hands trembling now that she was finally alone. The words echoed in her mind long after Lady Constance had gone. What kind of life awaited her child here, caught between a duke's uncertain resolve and a family determined to see her gone? She thought of her own childhood, raised by a widowed mother who had struggled every day to provide even the simplest comforts, and she wondered whether she was being foolish, prideful even, to remain in a house where she was so clearly unwanted by at least one member of the family that mattered most. That evening, Alina packed a small bag in the privacy of her room beneath the roof, telling herself it was only a precaution, that she was not truly deciding anything yet. But as she folded her few dresses and placed them carefully into the worn leather case that had once belonged to her mother, she found herself thinking of Julian's face in the garden that morning, the sincerity in his voice when he had promised she would not face this alone. She thought too of Lady Constance's cold certainty, that such promises rarely survived contact with the wider world. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the wind against the shutters, turning the decision over and over in her mind. And by the time the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the sky, she had made up her mind. She would leave before the household woke, before Julian could be pulled once more between his family's expectations and whatever tenderness he felt toward her, before she became the cause of a rift that might tear apart the only home Lily, poor motherless Lily, had left. She would go quietly, as Lady Constance wished, though not for the money that had been offered. She would go because she could not bear to become the reason a good man's family turned against him, and because, more than anything, she could not bear the uncertainty of waiting to discover whether his promise would hold. She left a short note on her pillow, addressed to no one in particular, and slipped down the servants' stairs into the cold morning air, her small bag clutched tightly in her hand, her heart breaking with every step that carried her further from Ashworth Hall, and the life she had, for one brief and shining day, allowed herself to imagine. She did not see the light already burning in the library window, where Julian, unable to sleep, had risen before dawn to write a letter of his own, one meant to reassure her that whatever his aunt had said, his promise remained unshaken. She did not know that within the hour, he would discover her empty room, her hastily written note, and the terrible truth that she had gone, alone, into a world that had never been kind to women in her position. By the time the sun had fully risen over Ashworth Hall, the household was in an uproar, and Julian, still in his night clothes, was already calling for his horse to be saddled, determined to find her before it was too late. The road from Ashworth Hall to the village of Kettlebridge ran through 6 miles of open farmland, and Julian covered it faster than he had ever ridden in his life. His horse's hooves tore up clumps of wet earth as he pushed the animal harder than was wise, his mind fixed on a single thought. She could not have gone far. The morning coach to London did not leave the village inn until 8:30, and if he rode hard enough, he might still catch her before it departed. He had found her note on the pillow only 20 minutes earlier, a few short lines written in a careful, trembling hand. She thanked him for his kindness. She wished him well. She said she could not be the cause of division within his family, and that she would find her own way, somewhere far from Ashworth Hall, where her child would not carry the weight of scandal upon its very first breath. She had not mentioned Lady Constance by name, but Julian did not need her to. He understood immediately what had happened, and fury rose in him alongside his fear, hot and sharp. He had confronted his aunt before leaving, finding her at breakfast as though nothing at all unusual had occurred. Her calm composure had only confirmed his suspicions. "What did you say to her?" he had demanded, standing over the table while she calmly buttered a piece of toast. "I spoke to her honestly, Julian, which is more than anyone else in this house seems willing to do. I offered her a generous settlement to leave quietly, for the good of everyone involved." "You had no right." "I had every right. I am the head of this household's affairs in matters of reputation, and I will not apologize for protecting what your father and grandfather built." Julian had not waited to hear more. He had stormed from the breakfast room, called for his horse, and ridden out into the gray morning without even pausing to eat, leaving his aunt sitting alone at the long table, her expression unreadable. Now, as Kettlebridge came into view ahead of him, its small stone church tower rising above the rooftops, Julian slowed his horse only slightly, scanning the road for any sign of Alina walking alone with her small bag. He saw nothing until he reached the village square itself, where the coaching inn stood with its familiar sign creaking gently in the morning breeze. A coach stood in the yard, horses already harnessed, a small cluster of passengers waiting to board. And there, near the back of the small crowd, stood Alina, her worn leather bag clutched in both hands, her face pale and drawn beneath the brim of her bonnet. "Alina!" She turned at the sound of his voice, her eyes widening in surprise, and something else too, something that looked almost like relief mixed with fear. Julian dismounted quickly, tossing the reins to a stable boy without a word, and crossed the yard in a few long strides, ignoring the curious glances of the other waiting passengers. "You should not have come," she said quietly as he approached, though she did not step away from him. "I could not let you leave without speaking to you first." He was breathing hard from the ride, his hair wind-blown, his coat unbuttoned in his haste. "Alina, please, tell me what happened. Tell me what my aunt said to you." Alina hesitated, glancing at the small crowd nearby, uncomfortable with the attention their conversation was beginning to attract. Julian noticed too, and gently took her elbow, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the inn yard, away from curious ears. "She offered me money to leave," Alina admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said your sympathy would not last, that men in your position do not truly marry governesses, whatever they might promise in a moment of shock. She said the kindest thing I could do for my child was to accept peace over pride." Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides, anger flooding through him at his aunt's cruelty, though beneath the anger ran a deeper current of guilt. "She was wrong, Alina. She was wrong to say any of that, and she was wrong to approach you at all without my knowledge. I am sorry. I should have anticipated this. I should have protected you from it." "You cannot control everything your aunt does, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "but I can control how I respond to it. And I will not let her words become the truth simply because she said them with such confidence." He paused, searching her face carefully, seeing the exhaustion there, the fear that had clearly kept her awake through the long night. "Alina, please, do not board that coach. Not because of any obligation you feel toward me, but because I am asking you honestly to give me the chance to prove that my promise was not an empty one." Alina looked toward the coach, where the driver was beginning to call for passengers to take their seats, then back toward Julian, torn between the fear that had driven her from the hall and the quiet hope his presence here, having ridden so hard and so early to find her, had begun to rekindle. "Where would I go?" she asked finally. "I cannot simply return to the hall as though nothing happened. Your aunt will not welcome me, and I do not wish to live under a roof where I am so clearly unwanted by someone with such influence over your family." Julian considered this for a moment, an idea forming slowly as he spoke. "There is a cottage at the edge of the estate near the old mill stream. It belonged to my grandmother in her later years, and it has stood empty since her passing. It is modest but comfortable, and it is far enough from the main house that you would not need to encounter my aunt unless you chose to. You could stay there under my protection, while we sort through everything that must still be decided. No one would question your presence there, and you would have time and space to consider what you truly wish for your future, without pressure from my family or from me." Alina studied him carefully, weighing his offer. It was not the promise of marriage, nor a declaration of love, but it was thoughtful, and it showed a genuine effort to consider her comfort and her dignity rather than simply his own convenience. Something in her chest, tight with fear since the moment she had left her bed that morning, began to ease slightly. "You would do that?" she asked. "I would do a great deal more than that if you would allow me the chance." Julian's voice softened, the urgency of the chase giving way to something quieter and more sincere. "Alina, I know I frightened you 2 nights ago with my shock and my questions. I know my aunt frightened you further with her threats, but I meant what I told you in the garden. I do not intend to abandon you or this child to face the world alone. Please, come back with me. Not to the hall, not yet, but to the cottage, where you can be safe and comfortable while we decide together what comes next." The coach driver called out once more, and Alina glanced toward it a final time, watching as the last few passengers climbed aboard, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud. For a moment, she imagined herself among them, riding away toward an uncertain future in London, alone, with no family, no position, and a child soon to be born into circumstances far harder than anything she had known even in her own modest upbringing. Then she looked back at Julian, standing before her with mud on his boots and desperation in his eyes, a duke who had ridden 6 miles without breakfast to catch a governess before she boarded a coach, and she made her decision. "Very well," she said quietly, "I will come with you to the cottage." Relief broke across Julian's face so plainly that Alina nearly smiled despite everything. He took her bag from her hands, and together they walked back toward his waiting horse, the coach pulling away behind them without her, its wheels rattling over the cobblestones of the village square. The ride back to Ashworth Hall was slower than the ride out had been, Julian walking his horse carefully with Alina seated before him, neither of them speaking much, both lost in thought as the fields rolled past. When they reached the edge of the estate, Julian guided the horse away from the main drive, following a narrower path that wound through a stand of old oak trees toward the mill stream, where a small stone cottage sat nestled among overgrown roses, its chimney cold, its windows dusty but intact. "It is not grand," Julian said as he helped her down from the horse, "but I will have it prepared properly within the day. A fire lit, fresh linens, whatever you might need." Alina looked at the cottage, its ivy-covered walls and crooked garden gate, and felt something unexpected settle over her, a quiet sense that perhaps, despite everything, she had not made a mistake in turning back. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly, "for coming after me." "I would have ridden twice as far," he said, and though his voice remained steady, something in his eyes told her he meant it completely. They stood together for a moment in the quiet morning light, the mill stream murmuring softly nearby, the first sense of true trust beginning to grow between them, fragile but real. Neither of them yet knew how much more difficult the road ahead would become, nor how soon Lady Constance would make her next move. But for now, in the shelter of the old cottage garden, it was enough simply to have found each other again. 3 weeks passed quietly at the cottage by the mill stream, and in that time, something gentle and unhurried began to grow between Julian and Alina, a friendship built on daily visits, shared conversation, and the slow, careful dismantling of the walls each of them had built around their hearts. Julian came every afternoon, ostensibly to check on repairs to the cottage or to bring news of Lily's progress with her lessons, though both of them understood, without ever saying so directly, that these visits had become the best part of each of their days. Lady Constance, for her part, had grown quieter since the morning Julian rode out after Alina, though her silence unsettled him more than her open opposition had. She said little about the matter now, but he had caught her watching him at dinner with an expression of calculating patience, as though she were simply waiting for the right moment to act again. Alina, meanwhile, had begun to settle into a fragile sense of peace at the cottage. The garden, wild and overgrown when she first arrived, had slowly begun to take shape under her careful attention, roses pruned back, weeds cleared from the small vegetable patch near the kitchen door. She found comfort in the simple, physical work, a way of quieting the anxious thoughts that still crept in at night when she was alone with the sound of the stream and her own uncertain future. It was on a Thursday afternoon, gray clouds gathering thick and low over the hills, that everything between them finally broke open. Julian had ridden out later than usual that day, delayed by a state business that had kept him at his desk long past the hour he normally allowed himself away from it. By the time he set out for the cottage, the sky had darkened considerably, and he could smell rain heavy in the air, but he pressed on regardless, unwilling to let a full day pass without seeing her. The storm broke just as he reached the mill stream, a sudden violent downpour that soaked through his coat within moments and sent his horse skittering nervously at the crack of thunder rolling overhead. He dismounted quickly near the small stable at the edge of the cottage grounds, intending to see the horse settled before dashing for the cottage door. But as he led the animal into the shelter of the stable, he found Alina already there, having come out to check on the goat she had recently taken to keeping, her hair plastered to her face, her dress soaked through despite the shawl she had thrown over her shoulders. "You should not be out in this," Julian said, raising his voice over the sound of rain hammering against the stable roof. "Neither should you," Alina replied, though there was warmth in her voice despite the chill of the storm. "I only came to bring the goat inside before the thunder frightened her further." They stood together in the dim light of the stable, the rain pounding relentlessly outside, the horse and goat shuffling restlessly in their makeshift shelter. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply looking at each other in a way they had both, until now, been careful to avoid. "Alina," Julian said finally, his voice quieter now, though the storm still raged around them. "There is something I have wanted to say to you for some time, and I find I can no longer keep it to myself." Alina's heart quickened, though she said nothing, waiting. "When you told me you were pregnant, that night in the library, my first reaction was shock, and I have told you already how deeply I regret that my shock led me to doubt you, even for a moment. But beneath the shock, Alina, there was something else. There was hope. A hope I had not allowed myself to feel in 7 long years, the hope that perhaps I was not as broken as I had believed, that perhaps I might yet have the family I had long ago convinced myself I would never have." He paused, water dripping from his hair, his eyes fixed intently on hers. "But it was not only the hope of a child that moved me that night. It was the hope that it might be with you specifically. I have watched you for 11 months now, Alina, teaching Lily beneath the oak tree, laughing quietly to yourself over some small joke only she understood, and I told myself again and again that such feelings were impossible for a man in my position. A duke does not fall in love with his niece's governess. That is what I told myself, over and over, until I nearly believed it." Alina's breath caught, her heart pounding now for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Julian," she said softly, using his given name for the first time since she had known him, "you do not have to say these things out of obligation. I do not wish for you to feel bound to me simply because of the child. This is not obligation." He stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the sincerity plain in his eyes, undisguised by any careful composure. "Alina, I love you. I believe I have loved you for months now, long before I understood what this feeling truly was. I did not speak of it because I believed it impossible, because I believed myself incapable of the very thing that has now brought us together. But I will not hide it from you any longer, whatever comes of it, whatever my aunt or society or anyone else might say." Tears mixed with rainwater on Alina's cheeks, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by feelings she had also tried, for months, to convince herself did not exist. She had told herself the same story he had, that such things were impossible, that a governess could not fall in love with a duke without inviting nothing but heartbreak and ruin. But standing here now, soaked through in a storm, hearing him speak so plainly and so honestly, she could no longer deny what she felt. "I love you too," she whispered finally. "I have tried so hard not to, Julian. I told myself it was foolish, that it could only end badly for me. But I cannot pretend any longer, not after everything we have been through together these past weeks." Julian reached for her then, gently, giving her every chance to step away if she wished, but she did not step away. She let him draw her close, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the dim, rain-soaked stable, holding each other in a way that spoke more truly than any words could have. "I want to marry you," Julian said finally, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "Not because of the child, though I love the thought of our child more than I can express, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. I want you as my wife, Alina, properly, publicly, whatever the cost to my family's pride or society's expectations." Alina's eyes widened, joy and fear mingling together in equal measure. "Julian, you know what people will say. A duke marrying his niece's governess. It will be scandal enough to follow us for years." "Let them talk," Julian said firmly. "I spent 7 years living quietly, believing myself unworthy of the very things I wanted most, allowing fear and old grief to shape every decision I made. I will not spend the rest of my life the same way, not now, not when I have finally found what I want. Marry me, Alina. Not tomorrow, not when it is convenient or when my aunt has come to accept it, but as soon as it can properly be arranged." Alina laughed through her tears, a sound of pure relief and joy that seemed to lighten even the storm raging outside. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing certainty, the rain still hammering against the stable roof around them, the horse and goat forgotten entirely in the corner. When they finally parted, both of them were breathless, laughing quietly at the absurdity and the beauty of the moment. A proposal made in a leaking stable during a summer storm, neither of them caring in the slightest that it had not happened in some grand ballroom or garden as such moments were meant to happen. "We will need to tell Lily," Alina said finally, wiping the rain and tears from her face. "She will be delighted, I think. She has grown very fond of me these past months." "She adores you," Julian agreed, smiling properly now for what felt like the first time in years. "And she will be overjoyed to learn she will soon have a cousin to play with as well." They waited out the worst of the storm together in the stable, talking quietly of the future now spread open before them, of the wedding that would need to be arranged, of the child who would arrive within the coming months, of the life they intended to build together despite whatever obstacles still stood in their path. When the rain finally eased to a gentle drizzle, they walked together back toward the cottage, hand in hand, neither of them minding the mud that clung to their boots or the chill that still lingered in the evening air. But even as they walked, warmed by newfound joy and certainty, neither of them noticed the figure watching from beneath the shelter of a distant tree, a servant sent by Lady Constance to keep watch on the cottage, who turned now and hurried back toward the hall with news that would set the next stage of their trial into motion. Lady Constance had not given up. She had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to strike, and the news that Julian intended to marry Alina, delivered to her that very evening by her loyal servant, gave her precisely the urgency she needed to act. She sat alone in her chamber long after the household had gone to bed, a single candle burning low, her mind working quickly through the possibilities available to her. If she could not convince Julian through reason, and she could not stop the marriage through simple opposition, then she would need something far more decisive, something that would leave him no choice but to reconsider. By the time the candle burned down to nothing, she had settled on her plan, and though it troubled even her own conscience slightly, she told herself it was for the good of the family, as it had always been. She would find a way to prove that Alina Whitmore was not the innocent, honest woman she appeared to be, whatever the cost, and whatever lies she might need to construct to do so. News of Julian's intention to marry Alina spread through Ashworth Hall within days, and though the household staff, most of whom had grown genuinely fond of the quiet governess over the past year, received the news with quiet delight, the wider world of London society reacted with the scandalized fascination Lady Constance had long predicted. Invitations to dinners and balls began arriving with pointed questions disguised as polite curiosity, and Julian found himself fielding uncomfortable inquiries from acquaintances who had never before shown much interest in his personal affairs. He did not care. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely happy, spending his evenings at the cottage with Alina, planning a modest wedding that would take place within the month, discussing names for the child who would arrive by winter, and slowly, carefully, introducing Lily to the idea that she would soon have a new aunt she already loved dearly as her teacher. Lady Constance watched all of this unfold with growing desperation, her careful plan taking shape slowly over the following 2 weeks. She had made discreet inquiries into Alina's background, hiring a private investigator through a solicitor she trusted to keep her name out of the matter entirely. The investigation turned up little of interest. Alina's father had died when she was young, her mother had raised her alone in modest circumstances in Yorkshire, and she had taken various positions as a governess since the age of 19, always with excellent references and no hint of scandal attached to her name. This lack of ammunition frustrated Lady Constance considerably, but it did not deter her. If the truth would not serve her purposes, she decided, then she would need to manufacture something that would. She had a talent, cultivated over many years of managing the complex social affairs of the Ashford family, for crafting letters in other people's hands, a skill she had once used innocently enough to help elderly relatives with their correspondence when their own hands grew too unsteady to write clearly. Now, she turned that same skill toward a far darker purpose. She spent several evenings practicing, studying samples of handwriting she had gathered from letters Alina had written to order supplies for the nursery, until she was confident she could produce something convincingly similar. The letter she eventually composed claimed to be written by a young man in Yorkshire, a former sweetheart of Alina's who claimed the child she now carried was, in fact, his own, conceived before she had ever left for her position at Ashworth Hall, and that she had fled to escape the consequences of an affair he had since abandoned. It was a cruel fiction, and Lady Constance knew it, but she told herself repeatedly, as she sealed the letter and prepared to have it delivered anonymously to Julian's study, that the ends justified the means. Better a temporary cruelty now, she reasoned, than the permanent ruin of the family's reputation that a scandalous marriage would surely bring. The letter arrived on Julian's desk 3 days later, delivered among his regular correspondence by a footman who had no idea of its true origin, having received it himself from a stranger paid to deliver it to the house without revealing who had sent him. Julian opened it that evening, expecting nothing more than routine estate business, and felt his stomach drop as he read the accusations within. The letter was crude but effective, filled with just enough specific detail about Alina's background, gathered no doubt from Lady Constance's earlier investigation, to lend it an unsettling air of authenticity. It named a village near Alina's childhood home, described a courtship that supposedly ended when the young man in question grew frightened of the responsibility a child would bring, and claimed that Alina had left Yorkshire specifically to escape the shame of her condition, taking a position as a governess far from anyone who might recognize the truth. Julian read the letter 3 times, his hands growing colder with each reading, old doubts he thought he had buried resurfacing despite his best efforts to dismiss them. He had believed Alina completely in the weeks since her confession in the stable, had trusted her honesty without reservation, but the specificity of this letter unsettled him in ways he had not expected. He told himself it was surely a lie, some cruel prank or attempt at blackmail, but a small, treacherous voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. He did not confront Alina immediately. Instead, driven by the same careful, methodical instincts that had led him to seek out Dr. Hale weeks earlier, he decided to investigate the letter's claims himself before allowing them to poison his trust in the woman he loved. He sent a discreet inquiry to a solicitor in York, asking him to look quietly into the details described in the letter, to determine whether such a young man or such a courtship had ever actually existed. The solicitor's response arrived within the week, and it confirmed what Julian had, in his heart, already begun to suspect. No young man matching the letter's description existed in the village named. No courtship of the kind described had ever taken place, and Alina's own mother, when discreetly approached by the solicitor's local contact, expressed bewildered confusion at the very suggestion, insisting her daughter had left Yorkshire for her position as a governess with nothing but excitement and hope for her future, with no scandal whatsoever attached to her departure. Relief flooded through Julian as he read the solicitor's report, followed quickly by a hot, sharp anger at whoever had constructed such a cruel fiction in an attempt to poison his trust. He turned the letter over in his hands, studying the handwriting more carefully now that he knew it to be false, comparing it against samples of correspondence from various members of his household and family, until something about the particular slant of certain letters, A habit he recognized from years of receiving notes and instructions from his aunt regarding household matters, caught his attention. He confronted Lady Constance that very evening, finding her in the drawing room after dinner, working on embroidery with the same calm composure she always maintained, as though she had not spent the past weeks constructing an elaborate deception designed to destroy his happiness. "I received an interesting letter recently," Julian said, closing the drawing room door behind him and producing the folded paper from his coat pocket. Lady Constance's needle paused for only a fraction of a second before continuing its steady rhythm. "Oh, and what did it say?" "It claimed that Alina had a previous lover in Yorkshire, a man who fathered the child she now carries and abandoned her before she came to us." Julian watched his aunt's face carefully as he spoke, noting the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hands, though still moving, had grown noticeably less steady. "I had it investigated. There is no truth to any of it. No young man exists matching the letter's description. No courtship of any kind occurred. It was, in every particular, a complete fabrication." "How unfortunate," Lady Constance said, her voice carefully neutral, though she did not look up from her embroidery. "Some jealous rival perhaps seeking to cause trouble for the girl." "I do not think so." Julian's voice hardened now, all patience gone. "I compared the handwriting, Aunt Constance, to letters I have received from you over the years regarding household matters. The similarities are considerable. Would you care to explain how a stranger from Yorkshire happened to write in a hand so remarkably like your own?" The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, Lady Constance's needle finally stilling entirely in her hands. When she looked up at last, her expression had shed its careful composure, replaced by something defiant and unrepentant. "I did what I believed necessary to protect this family," she said finally, setting her embroidery aside. "You cannot see clearly, Julian, blinded as you are by whatever affection you have convinced yourself you feel for that girl. I have watched this family for 2 decades. I have seen the respect your father and grandfather built through careful, prudent choices. I will not stand by silently while you throw all of that away for a governess with no family, no fortune, and no standing whatsoever." "So you forged a letter," Julian said, his voice shaking now with barely controlled fury, "accusing an innocent woman of the very deception you yourself were practicing. You attempted to poison my trust in her with lies, to manipulate me into abandoning her through cruelty and dishonesty. I did what was necessary. You did what was despicable." Julian crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white with anger. "Alina has done nothing but tell me the truth from the very first moment, even when the truth put her own position and reputation at risk. She has faced your threats, your bribes, and now your lies with nothing but honesty and dignity, while you, my own aunt, someone I trusted to have this family's genuine interests at heart, have resorted to forgery and deceit to serve your own narrow vision of what this family should be." Lady Constance rose from her chair, her own anger flaring now to match his. "Someone must protect this family's interests, since you clearly will not. This family's interests are served by honesty, not by cruelty toward an innocent woman who has done nothing to deserve it. I will not tolerate this any further, Aunt Constance. You will make no further attempts to interfere in my relationship with Alina, nor in our upcoming marriage. If you cannot accept this, then I must ask you to consider whether Ashworth Hall remains a suitable home for you." The threat, quiet but unmistakable, hung heavy in the air between them. Lady Constance's face paled slightly, understanding at last that she had pushed her nephew further than she had intended, risking not only her plan but her very place within the household she had called home for 20 years. "You would truly turn me out over this?" "I would truly turn you out over cruelty and deception practiced against the woman I intend to marry, yes." Julian's voice remained steady now, though the anger still burned beneath it. "I have given you every consideration these past weeks, Aunt Constance. I have listened to your concerns, weighed your objections, and tried to understand your perspective, however much I disagreed with it. But this, forging a letter designed to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and my trust in her, this I cannot forgive so easily. You will apologize to Alina, properly and sincerely, and you will cease all further interference in this matter. Should you refuse, you may consider your welcome at Ashworth Hall at an end." Lady Constance said nothing for a long moment, torn between her wounded pride and the very real fear of losing the only home she had known for 2 decades. Finally, her shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of her. "Very well," she said quietly. "I will apologize if that is what you require. But I want it known, Julian, that everything I have done, however misguided you believe it to be, I have done out of genuine concern for this family's future." "I understand that you believe that," Julian said, his voice softening slightly now that the worst of his anger had passed. "But belief in one's own good intentions does not excuse cruelty toward others. I hope, in time, you will come to see Alina as I do, not as a threat to this family's future, but as someone who will strengthen it immeasurably." He left the drawing room without waiting for her response, the crumpled letter still clutched in his hand, his mind already turning toward the cottage by the mill stream, where Alina waited, unaware of the storm that had nearly engulfed their happiness once more. He needed to see her, to hold her, to reassure himself that despite his aunt's cruel deception, nothing had truly changed between them. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, he was more determined than ever to face them together, with honesty as their foundation and nothing left to hide. Word travels quickly among the great families of England, and despite Julian's best efforts to keep the details of the forged letter contained within his own household, whispers of trouble at Ashworth Hall had already begun to circulate through London drawing rooms by the time the annual autumn gathering arrived, an event long planned before any of these troubles had begun, bringing together extended family and prominent neighbors for a weekend of dinners, music, and careful social maneuvering that Julian now had little appetite for. He had considered canceling the gathering entirely, given everything that had unfolded in recent weeks, but his steward advised strongly against it, noting that too many important guests had already made their travel arrangements, and that canceling now would only fuel further speculation about troubles within the family. Reluctantly, Julian agreed to proceed, though he resolved privately that he would use the occasion not to hide from the gossip surrounding his engagement, but to address it directly, on his own terms. Alina had been apprehensive about attending, uncertain of her welcome among Julian's extended family, and the prominent guests who would be watching her every move with undisguised curiosity. But Julian had insisted, gently but firmly, that she attend as his intended wife, not as someone to be hidden away out of shame or fear of judgment. "If we are to build a life together," he told her the evening before the gathering, as they sat together in the cottage garden watching the last of the autumn light fade over the hills, "then we must begin as we intend to continue, honestly and without apology. I will not have you treated as a secret to be managed, Alina. You will stand beside me as my future wife, and anyone who has objections may voice them to my face." The gathering began on Friday evening with a formal dinner attended by nearly 40 guests, including several distant cousins Julian saw rarely, a handful of prominent neighboring families, and much to Julian's private displeasure, several particularly gossip-hungry acquaintances from London who had accepted the invitation with unusual eagerness, no doubt hoping to witness some dramatic confirmation of the rumors already swirling about the household. Alina entered the dining room on Julian's arm, dressed simply, but elegantly in a gown Julian had insisted on having made for her, dark blue silk that suited her coloring beautifully without appearing ostentatious. She held her head high despite the curious glances that followed her across the room, and Julian felt a fierce pride swell in his chest at her composure, knowing full well how difficult this evening must be for her. The dinner itself proceeded with the careful, stilted politeness typical of such gatherings, conversation skating carefully around the obvious questions everyone wished to ask but few dared voice directly. It was not until the meal had concluded and guests had begun to move toward the drawing room for after-dinner conversation that the tension finally broke, and it was Lady Constance herself, still smarting from her earlier confrontation with Julian and perhaps hoping to salvage some measure of her wounded pride, who inadvertently provided the opening. "I do hope," she said to a cluster of guests within easy earshot of Julian and Alina, her voice carrying just enough to ensure it would be heard, "that everyone here understands the delicacy of the current situation. My nephew has always been a man of great feeling, sometimes to his own detriment, and I fear certain parties may have taken advantage of his generous nature." The implication was clear enough, and several guests turned curious, expectant eyes toward Julian and Alina, waiting to see how the Duke would respond to his aunt's pointed remark. Julian felt Alina's hand tense slightly on his arm, and he covered it gently with his own, steadying her before he spoke. "My aunt raises an interesting point," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the drawing room, drawing the attention of nearly every guest present. "Since the matter has been raised, perhaps this is the appropriate moment to address it directly, rather than allowing it to continue circulating as whispered speculation." A hush fell over the room, guests exchanging glances, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Lady Constance's face paled slightly, clearly not having anticipated that her comment would prompt such a direct response. "Several weeks ago," Julian continued, "I received a letter, delivered anonymously, containing serious accusations against Miss Whitmore, accusations of a previous scandal in her past, of a deception practiced against myself and this family. I investigated these claims thoroughly, through a solicitor in Yorkshire, and found them to be entirely false, a complete fabrication from beginning to end." He paused, letting his words settle over the assembled guests before continuing, his eyes moving deliberately to his aunt's face. "I also discovered, through careful comparison of handwriting, that this letter was not written by any stranger with a grudge against Miss Whitmore, but by a member of my own family, someone who claimed to act out of concern for this household's reputation, but who in truth acted out of cruelty and deception toward a woman who has done nothing but show honesty and dignity throughout this entire ordeal." Gasps rippled through the room, guests turning to stare openly now at Lady Constance, whose composure had finally cracked entirely under the weight of public exposure. She opened her mouth as though to protest, then closed it again, seeming to realize that any denial now would only compound her humiliation. "I say this," Julian continued, "not to shame my aunt further than her own actions have already shamed her, but because I will not allow whispers and half-truths to define Miss Whitmore's character in the eyes of this family and our friends. She has faced suspicion, bribery, and outright deception with nothing but grace and honesty. She carries my child, and she will soon become my wife, and I would ask that anyone here who wishes to remain a welcome guest in this house extend to her the same respect and courtesy they would extend to any woman I chose to marry, regardless of the circumstances of our meeting or the modesty of her birth." The silence that followed was profound, guests processing the shocking revelation of Lady Constance's deception alongside Julian's unequivocal defense of Alina's character. Slowly, tentatively, one of the older guests, a distant cousin who had known Julian since childhood, stepped forward and offered Alina a small, respectful bow. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I believe congratulations are in order. Any woman who can inspire such devoted loyalty from my cousin, and endure what you have clearly endured with such grace, deserves nothing but our respect and good wishes." His gesture broke the tension in the room, and slowly, other guests began to follow his lead, offering their own words of congratulation, some perhaps more sincere than others, but none willing to openly voice objection after witnessing Julian's forceful and public defense of his intended bride. Lady Constance, meanwhile, stood isolated near the edge of the room, her earlier composure entirely shattered, aware that her own reputation among this gathering of family and friends had suffered a wound far more serious than anything she had attempted to inflict on Alina. She left the gathering early that evening, retreating to her chamber without waiting for the final course of after-dinner refreshments, and though she remained at Ashworth Hall for several more weeks while arrangements were made for her to take up residence with a distant cousin in Bath, she never again attempted to interfere in Julian and Alina's relationship. Whatever bitterness she still harbored, she kept carefully to herself, understanding at last that her nephew's resolve on this matter would not be shaken by further scheming. Alina, for her part, found herself overwhelmed by the evening's events, torn between relief at Julian's unwavering public defense and lingering discomfort at having become the center of such dramatic attention. Later that night, after the guests had retired and the house had finally grown quiet, Julian found her in the garden outside the drawing room, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, looking up at the stars scattered across the clear autumn sky. "You did not need to expose your aunt so publicly," she said quietly as he approached. "You could have simply asked her to leave quietly without such a scene before your guests." "Perhaps," Julian admitted, coming to stand beside her. "But I have spent too many years allowing quiet, careful avoidance to define how I handle difficult matters. I wanted everyone present tonight to understand, without any doubt remaining, that you are not a temporary indiscretion to be quietly managed and eventually dismissed. You are the woman I love, and the woman I intend to marry, and I will not have anyone, family or otherwise, treat you with anything less than the respect you deserve." Alina leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling for the first time since this entire ordeal began a genuine sense of security, a certainty that whatever challenges still awaited them, Julian would face them beside her, openly and without hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me even when it would have been easier not to." "There was never anything easier about not believing in you," Julian replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they stood together beneath the vast autumn sky. "Loving you has been the easiest, truest thing I have done in 7 long years, Alina. Everything else, all the doubt and fear and difficulty, that has only ever come from the world around us, never from what I feel in my own heart." They remained in the garden a while longer, the events of the evening settling slowly into something that felt, at last, like genuine peace, the worst of the obstacles standing between them now finally overcome, and the wedding that would unite them properly before the world drawing steadily, joyfully closer. The wedding took place on a crisp morning in early December, in the small stone chapel that had stood on the Ashworth estate for over 200 years, its windows filled with pale winter light, its old wooden pews polished carefully for the occasion. It was a modest ceremony compared to the grand society weddings London society had come to expect from a duke, attended only by close family, the household staff who had grown fond of Alina over the past year, and a handful of true friends who had stood by them throughout the difficult months leading up to this day. Alina wore a simple gown of pale cream silk, her hair arranged with a few winter roses grown in the very garden she had tended so carefully at the cottage by the mill stream. And as she walked down the short aisle toward Julian, who stood waiting at the altar with an expression of such open joy that even the most hardened of gossips among the small gathering could not help but be moved, she felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had haunted her in the early weeks of this journey. Lily, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of a new aunt she already loved dearly, scattered rose petals along the aisle with an enthusiasm that drew soft laughter from the assembled guests, her small face beaming with a happiness that reflected the joy filling the entire chapel. Even Lady Constance, who had returned briefly from Bath at Julian's invitation, extended reluctantly but sincerely in the weeks following her public humiliation, sat quietly near the back of the chapel, her expression unreadable but no longer hostile, perhaps beginning, in her own slow way, to accept what she could not change. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, the elderly vicar who had known Julian since his own christening speaking warmly of the unexpected paths love sometimes took, paths that defied convention and expectation but led, when followed with honesty and courage, to genuine happiness. When Julian slipped the ring onto Alina's finger and spoke his vows in a voice thick with emotion, promising to love and protect her for all the days of his life, Alina felt the last of her old fears finally, completely dissolve, replaced by a certainty she had never expected to feel again after everything they had endured together. Winter passed quietly and happily at Ashworth Hall following the wedding, the household settling into a new rhythm around its duchess, who continued, even after her marriage, to spend cherished hours each week teaching Lily her letters, though now from the comfortable position of family rather than employment. The estate, which had felt for years like a grand but somewhat empty house, echoing with too much silence and too little laughter, slowly began to fill with warmth, servants noting with quiet approval how much lighter the atmosphere had become, how often laughter now drifted through corridors that had stood too quiet for too long. The child arrived in the depths of February, during a heavy snowfall that blanketed the entire estate in white, muffling the world outside while inside the hall, in a bedchamber warmed by a roaring fire, and filled with the quiet, urgent activity of midwives and physicians. Alina brought their son into the world after a long and difficult labor that left Julian pacing the corridor outside for hours, unable to eat or sit still. His mind consumed entirely with fear for the two people he loved most in the world. When at last the physician emerged to tell him that both mother and child were healthy and resting, Julian felt a relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. He entered the bedchamber quietly, finding Alina exhausted but radiant, propped against a mountain of pillows, cradling a small bundle wrapped carefully in soft blankets against the winter chill. "Come and meet your son," she said softly, her voice thick with exhaustion and love in equal measure. Julian crossed the room slowly, as though approaching something too precious and fragile to disturb, and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the tiny face peering up at him from within the blankets, wide dark eyes blinking slowly in the firelight. He reached out with careful, trembling hands and took his son for the first time, cradling the small weight against his chest with a tenderness that surprised even himself. He thought in that quiet moment of everything that had led him here, the terrible fever that had nearly claimed his life at 25, the years of grief and resignation that followed, believing himself forever incapable of this exact moment. This exact joy now filling his chest so completely he could hardly breathe around it. He thought of Margaret, the woman he had loved and lost, and found to his surprise that he felt no lingering bitterness toward the past, only gratitude that the path life had taken, however painful at times, had led him ultimately to this room, this fire, this woman, and this child. "He is perfect," Julian said finally, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Absolutely perfect." "What shall we name him?" Alina asked, watching her husband's face with quiet joy, seeing in his expression a peace she had never witnessed in him before, not even in the happiest moments of their courtship. Julian considered the question carefully, looking down at his son's small face, already so clearly bearing the shape of his own features, the same dark hair, the same steady gaze that had marked generations of the Ashford family before him. "Henry," he said finally, "after my grandfather, who always told me that the truest measure of a man was not his title or his fortune, but his willingness to fight for what he believed was right, whatever the cost. I believe he would have liked you very much, Alina, and I believe he would be proud of the family we have built." Word of the birth spread quickly through the estate and beyond, and in the weeks that followed, well-wishes arrived from every corner of the family's extended acquaintance, including, to Julian's quiet satisfaction, a carefully worded letter from Lady Constance herself, expressing genuine congratulations, and buried within the formal language, something that read almost like an apology for the pain she had caused during those difficult early months. Julian showed the letter to Alina, and together they agreed to extend an invitation for Lady Constance to visit and meet young Henry properly, a small gesture of reconciliation that neither of them felt obligated to make, but chose to offer regardless, understanding that forgiveness, freely given, often proved more powerful than resentment carefully preserved. Spring arrived at Ashworth Hall with its usual gentle transformation, snow melting away to reveal the gardens beginning their slow awakening, the mill stream running fuller and faster with the seasonal thaw, the old cottage where Alina had once sought refuge, now standing as a cherished landmark of the difficult journey that had brought them together, occasionally visited by the family for quiet picnics beneath the very oak tree where Julian had first confessed his intention to marry her. Regardless of scandal or consequence, Lily grew close to her young cousin as the months passed, delighting in her role as the eldest child of the household, proudly showing baby Henry off to visitors and servants alike with the fierce pride only a devoted older cousin could display. Alina, watching the two children together on sunny afternoons in the garden, often found herself marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying night she had stood outside the library door, candle trembling in her hand, uncertain whether she would be believed or cast out entirely. Julian, for his part, found himself a changed man in ways that extended far beyond the simple joy of fatherhood he had once believed impossible. The years of quiet resignation that had defined so much of his adult life gave way to a new openness, a willingness to speak honestly about his own fears and hopes rather than burying them beneath careful composure. He became known, among his peers and tenants alike, as a duke who listened carefully, who valued honesty over convenient appearance, and who had learned through his own difficult journey that true strength lay not in avoiding vulnerability, but in facing it directly with courage and with love. Looking back, in quiet moments shared with Alina by the fireside as their son grew from infant to toddler, Julian often reflected on how close he had come to losing everything through fear alone, how easily a single moment of doubt, sustained instead of overcome, might have driven Alina away forever, leaving him to live out his days in the same quiet loneliness he had known before her arrival. He was endlessly grateful that fate, and Alina's own quiet courage, had given him the chance to choose differently, to fight for the family he had once believed entirely beyond his reach. Their story, whispered at first through scandalized drawing rooms and later remembered fondly as one of the great love stories among the great families of England, became in time a source of quiet pride rather than shame, a testament to the idea that love, honesty, and courage could overcome even the deepest fears and the most determined opposition. Ashworth Hall, once a house defined by silence and old grief, became instead a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the steady, unshakable devotion of a duke and his duchess, who had found each other against every expectation, and who never, for a single day afterward, took that fortune for granted. 5 years passed at Ashworth Hall, years marked by the ordinary joys and small troubles of family life, Henry growing from a solemn infant into a curious, energetic boy who followed his father through the stables and fields with unrelenting enthusiasm, while Lily, now approaching her own adolescence, had grown into a thoughtful young woman who still credited Alina, above all others, with teaching her to love books and learning. The scandal that had once threatened to define their marriage had faded gradually into distant memory, replaced in the minds of London society by newer gossip and fresher controversies, and Julian and Alina had settled into a quiet, contented rhythm neither of them had thought possible in those anxious early days. It was therefore an unwelcome shock when a letter arrived one autumn morning from a solicitor representing a distant cousin of Julian's, a man named Edmund Ashford, who had spent most of his life in relative obscurity managing a modest property in the north, but who now, it seemed, had developed sudden and pointed interest in the legitimacy of Henry's claim to the Ashworth title and inheritance. The letter was carefully worded, full of legal language designed to sound measured and reasonable, but its intent was unmistakable. Edmund's solicitor questioned whether Henry, born so soon after his parents' marriage, and following years during which Julian had been widely understood, even among close family, to be incapable of fathering children, could rightfully be considered the true heir to the duchy. The letter suggested, delicately but unmistakably, that a formal inquiry might be necessary to settle the matter definitively, an inquiry that would require Julian and Alina to submit to invasive questioning and possibly even medical examination, all conducted under the watchful eye of lawyers eager to find any justification for transferring the inheritance to Edmund's own line instead. Julian read the letter twice at his breakfast table, his appetite vanishing entirely, old anger rising in him with a familiarity that surprised him, given how many years had passed since he had last needed to defend his family against such calculated cruelty. Alina, watching his face darken as he read, set down her own cup of tea with quiet concern. "What is it?" she asked. He handed her the letter without a word, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a controlled anger that mirrored his own. When she finished reading, she set the paper down carefully on the table, her hands steady despite the fury he could see building behind her calm exterior. "He waited 5 years to raise this," she said. "Why now?" Julian had already begun turning the question over in his mind. "I suspect our cousin has recently come into some financial difficulty of his own, and has decided that contesting Henry's legitimacy offers a more promising solution than managing his own estate more prudently. It is a desperate move, Alina, but a dangerous one nonetheless. Even a false claim, pursued persistently enough through the courts, can create genuine difficulty for Henry's future, tangling his inheritance in years of costly legal dispute even if we ultimately prevail." They spent that entire day in quiet, careful discussion, considering their options. Julian's solicitor, summoned urgently from London, confirmed what Julian already suspected, that while Edmund's claim had little genuine legal foundation, the mere act of raising a formal challenge could create years of uncertainty and expense, particularly given the unusual circumstances surrounding Henry's birth, circumstances that had once been the subject of considerable public gossip and speculation. "We must be thorough," the solicitor advised. "I recommend gathering every piece of evidence available to us, medical records, witness testimony, anything that firmly establishes Henry's legitimate claim, so that we may present an overwhelming case should this matter proceed to any formal inquiry." That evening, after the solicitor had departed and the household had grown quiet, Julian found himself once again in his study, the same room where Alina had first whispered her news to him nearly 6 years earlier. He sat at his desk, looking through old correspondence, old medical records from Dr. Hale, the very evidence that had once restored his own hope and understanding, and felt a strange, circular sense of history repeating itself, old doubts resurrected by new and unwelcome hands. Alina found him there past midnight, still surrounded by papers, his expression tired but resolute. "You should be resting," she said softly, coming to sit beside him. "I keep thinking of that first night," Julian admitted, setting down the papers he had been reviewing. "How frightened I was, not truly of you, but of what your news meant about everything I had believed true about myself. I never imagined we would need to defend that truth so thoroughly, so many years later, against someone who was not even present for any of it." Alina took his hand gently, lacing her fingers through his. "We defended it once already, Julian, against far greater odds than we face now. We have Dr. Hale's records, we have the memory of everyone who witnessed our marriage and Henry's birth, and we have each other. Whatever Edmund hopes to gain through this challenge, he will find us far better prepared to face it than he perhaps expects." Her steady confidence, so different from the frightened but determined young woman who had once stood trembling outside his library door, filled Julian with renewed resolve. Together, over the following weeks, they gathered every piece of evidence available, Dr. Hale himself traveling from London to provide formal testimony regarding his original examination, and his professional opinion on the likely error in Julian's earlier diagnosis, the vicar who had performed their marriage ceremony offering his own account of the timeline surrounding their wedding, and even Lady Constance, now living contentedly in Bath but maintaining regular correspondence with the family, offering a written statement acknowledging her own earlier doubts and confirming that she had found no evidence whatsoever, despite her own thorough investigation at the time, to support any suggestion of impropriety on Alina's part. When Edmund's solicitor received this comprehensive body of evidence, carefully compiled and formally presented through Julian's own legal representatives, the challenge that had seemed so threatening in its initial letter began to lose its force almost immediately. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy and expensive legal battle against evidence so thoroughly documented, and unable to produce any genuine grounds for his claim beyond convenient speculation, Edmund quietly withdrew his challenge within a matter of months, retreating once more into the obscurity from which he had briefly emerged. The relief that followed was profound. Though Julian and Alina both understood, in the quiet conversations that followed the challenge's resolution, that they had been fortunate in ways not every family facing such circumstances could rely upon. They resolved, in the years that followed, to ensure that Henry, and any future children they might have, grew up understanding not only the privileges of their position, but the responsibilities and vulnerabilities that came with it as well, the importance of honesty, careful documentation, and steady character in defending against those who might seek to exploit uncertainty for their own gain. Henry himself, too young at the time to fully understand the legal challenge that had briefly threatened his future, grew into adulthood with little memory of the episode, beyond a vague childhood impression that his parents had once been very busy and preoccupied for several months. He grew instead into a young man who embodied the values his parents had worked so hard to establish, honest in his dealings, thoughtful in his judgments, and deeply devoted to the family and the people who depended upon the Ashworth estate for their livelihoods. Lily married happily some years later, a match built on genuine affection rather than convenient arrangement, and continued to credit Alina, in speeches at her own wedding celebration, with teaching her that love and honesty mattered more than position or wealth, lessons she carried forward into her own family in the years that followed. Julian and Alina themselves grew old together at Ashworth Hall, their early trials becoming, with the passage of time, not painful memories to be avoided, but treasured chapters in a larger story they told willingly to their grandchildren gathered by the fireside on winter evenings, a story of doubt overcome by trust, of cruelty answered with honesty, and of a love that had proven, again and again, stronger than every obstacle raised against it. The old cottage by the mill stream remained in the family for generations, a quiet reminder of the night a frightened young governess had chosen to trust in a promise rather than flee into an uncertain future, and of the Duke who had ridden through 6 miles of open country to prove that his word, once given, could always be trusted completely. In the end, the whispered words that had once thrown an entire household into turmoil became, in the family's own retelling, not a moment of scandal to be quietly forgotten, but the true beginning of everything that mattered most, the foundation upon which an entire lifetime of happiness had been carefully, faithfully built.